Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Sermon Time with me, Pastor Tony, where we again assemble around the Word of God, particularly in the book of Revelation. In the history of the world, there have been many evil people, bad guys, villains, but there is no villain like the one we're going to study about today. The Bible pictures the evils of this end-time power in three sweeping characteristics. One, it's a political power that arises after the Roman Empire divides into the European nation states. Two, this state forces upon the world a false system of worship. And three, we read and learn from the text, it has mastered the black arts of spiritualism. We're talking today about Bible prophecy's third and final entity in the end-time trinity of evil. What we're going to learn is this power, this third entity, is the worst of them all. We're in Revelation 13 today, and we are focused on who the beast is that comes up from the land, what I have dubbed the world's worst enemy. And we need to come to terms with what it is this power is doing that makes it so evil, and determine for ourselves we will never be a part of those evils. Let's begin with reading the description of that land beast in Revelation 13, verses 11 and 12, where its first two characteristics are established. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the land, and he had two horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. All right, so what do we have here? Well, first of all, we have a beast. And in Bible prophecy, we know what beasts are because the symbolism is explained abundantly. Beasts are hostile governments. In our text, it says it exercises authority. Some versions say power. But the word is authority, political authority. the power of the state. In Daniel 7:23, the same beastly imagery is used and explained. Thus he said, "The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces." So beasts are kingdoms, violent political authorities that have vast territories and massive amounts of power. The beast that comes up from the earth is no different. Notice again our opening verse. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So the land beast is a global power, and this global power is forcing upon the earth a false system of worship with an unworthy object of that worship, the first beast that comes up out of the sea. So, for ease of communication, I will refer to these two beasts as the sea beast and the land beast, okay? Two beasts that arise into power in two very different locations, but share a common goal to force upon the earth the worship of the sea beast. In our attempt to identify who this land beast is, there are two further points we need to establish from what we have read so far. One, we need to establish we are looking at a religio-political power here, characterized by an unholy combination of church and state. And two, the contrast between the land and the sea. Let's start with the unholy combination of church and state. It was never God's plan to have his people propagate the church through the power of the state. We will establish this with the words of Jesus in Matthew 20, verses 25 and 26. But Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you." Jesus is here addressing his disciples, his church, and he tells them never to use the power of the state to force worship on others. That's how people in the world do it, but may it never be so among you, never. And yet the land and the sea beasts don't seem to understand how the power of the state corrupts the purity of the church. It seems to keep the church and state in an unholy alliance, and that's its problem. Now, as to the second point, the contrast between the land and the sea. One beast in Revelation 13 comes up out of the sea and the other out of the land. This is an interesting contrast, and I want to just take a brief moment with this. The contrast between land and sea is made first in the beginning. I mean, the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1. You'll remember that in the beginning, just before God would say, "Let there be light, let there be a sky, let there be land," it says the Holy Spirit hovered over the face of the waters. There was a watery mass of a planet, no land yet in the earth. Land appeared after God said on the third day, "Let there be land." The waters offered a habitat for the fish and sea creatures that would be created on day 5. The sky or firmament would offer habitat to the birds, also created on day 5. Then you have the creation of the land, when God caused the land to come up out of the sea. It provided a habitat for the creatures made on day 6 of creation, land animals and humans. It is this notion of the land creating a safe space for man to live and thrive and worship God that I want to take into our story in Revelation. Mankind is not meant to live in the sea. Man is meant to live on the land, not in the air, on the land. It is what keeps him safe and protected, and provides for his need for food and water. The sea, by contrast, is the opposite. It is hostile to human life. It's uninhabitable, destructive to our habitat, the land. We can't drink its water, and so on. So this is the original contrast. Let's notice the same contrast made again in Revelation chapter 12, verses 15 and 16. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. So the serpent here is the devil, and he's trying to destroy the church, the woman, by using what? By using water, a flood of water. But something helps the woman. What was it that helps the church? The earth, the land. Do you see that? The water is harmful, the earth is helpful to the life of the church. We're now ready for Revelation 17:15, which explains to us the exact meaning of the symbol of water in the prophecies of Revelation. The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Revelation 17 depicts an illicit woman, an unholy church, sitting upon the waters. The word sitting is what kings do on their thrones. This unholy church is ruling over peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. Again, an unholy mixture of church and state. We know what church this is. There has, in the history of the world, only ever been one Christian church that is ruled also as a state. We are now ready to name it. It is the Roman Catholic Church, situated among the nations of Europe, in Italy, in Rome, at the Vatican, upon the waters among the peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages of Europe. That is the sea beast. The land beast is something altogether different, yet oddly familiar. Anyone familiar with the religious history of Europe would know that the states there, the various governments of that continent, were not open to the free exercise of one's religion. You could not, for example, follow the dictates of your own conscience. You could not follow the teachings of the Bible because your religion was determined by the state. If your prince was Catholic, you were Catholic. If your prince was Protestant, you were Protestant. If you believed and practiced something different, you would be reprimanded. You could be punished, fined, imprisoned, shunned, have your lands and businesses stripped away, your freedom taken from you, your very life ended. That was Europe, as the sea beast neared the date when it received its deadly wound. That date, by the way, was 1798. Exactly 1,260 years, or 42 prophetic months, after it emerged into its religion-political prominence. The very span of time determined by multiple Bible prophecies in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The religions of the European states became hostile to a biblical faith. A mass migration took place which carried true believers far from the densely populated European continent to a place described in the Bible as land. By contrast to the churning, billowing sea which was hostile to the church, the land provided a protective safe haven where the church could thrive. That land was America. And the emergence of America in the middle of the 18th century places it firmly on the unfolding prophetic timeline. America at that time is seen as protecting true faith occurring around the time of the deadly wound dealt to the papacy, again, at the end of the 18th century. It becomes clear our interpretation is accurate. The land beast is America. Let's test our interpretation so far. We learned that the land beast works on behalf of the sea beast. That there's a kind of cohort between these two once hostile entities. For decades now, we have seen in America that this happening. America has become more and more open to cooperating with the Vatican on the world stage. In my lifetime, America has established diplomatic ties with the Vatican, has formed several alliances with Rome, including one that brought down the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Iron Curtain in Europe. During this same time, the hostilities that have existed between Protestants and Catholics has waned. And you may be thinking, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? It would be if only they were uniting around biblical teachings and God's commandments, but that is not the case. They're putting doctrine aside and uniting anyhow. That's its problem. Better to see the enmity endure between these two, the Protestants and the Catholics, than to decide it doesn't matter what we believe or whose commandments we obey, only that we get along. Also, we said earlier that the land beast is a global power, and it goes without saying America too is a global power. So that checks out. The unholy trinity in Revelation 13 is between the devil, the sea beast, which is the Vatican, and one other global power, described as like a lamb, and yet like the dragon. That third power can only be America. There's no other possibility. It emerged into prominence as the papacy's power waned, as it received its deadly wound. The region was sparsely populated at its beginning, yet became a global power. And it helped the church in its darkest hour from the persecutions in the old country. It's because of the religious freedoms we enjoy in America that we even have a church. And that right is enshrined in our very Constitution, which places a proper barrier between the functions of the church and the interference of the state. To summarize what we have said so far, 1. We have said that the land beast is a political power that arises sometime after the divisions of the European nation states, America. And 2, we have said that it combines the power of the state with the mission of the church and uses that to force upon the world a false system of worship, the worship of the sea beast. That would be Protestant America. And 3, the final thing we said about this religious political power is that it is steeped in spiritualism. That would be apostate Protestant America. Now, where do we get that idea from about spiritualism? There are several lines of evidence in the book of Revelation. The first is found in verse 11. He had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. It is this phrase, spoke like a dragon, we need to take a look at next. We have already covered the fact that the dragon is the devil, Satan. But in Revelation 12:9, he is also called the serpent of old, or as some translations put it, that ancient serpent, or that serpent of ancient times. This cast into the Old Testament lands us squarely in Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent met Eve in the Garden of Eden, tempted her to eat the forbidden fruit with a lie. Spoke like a dragon? This is what the dragon said. You will not surely die. You can sin against God, you can break his commandments, but you will not pay any penalty for your sin. That's what he told her. You will live on even after you die. This is the first hint of the cult of spiritualism found in the Bible. It is the biggest of big lies. Spiritualism teaches that when a person dies, their spirit lives on, still has an existence, still interacts with the living from the great beyond. The notion is so replete in our culture we hardly recognize it anymore. But just to cite a few examples, it's everywhere in the Star Wars series, right? It's also found in the movie Ghost when the character Patrick Swayze, who was having sex with a woman he wasn't married to, dies, can't enter heaven, not because of his sin on earth, but he has to kill the man who killed him in order to get to his woman. That's the basic plot of the story. We also saw spiritualism growing up with weekend cartoons where you could see Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam when they died. One floats upward with angel's wings while the other sinks downward with devil's horns and a pitchfork. Why, nowadays there are multiple channels on cable TV to help one contact the dead, to channel the world on the other side, and so on. There are no voices in our culture that promote the biblical truth in any big way, enough to sway culture at least. Voices that portray the biblical position, such as the dead sleep, know nothing, no longer participate in anything done under the sun, are in the graves, or are awaiting resurrection. No, hardly a single voice. In many countries in the world, spiritualism is as common as breathing and eating. The world is set up for the final deception where spiritualism is about to be unleashed in all its fullness. An unprecedented display of demonic power masquerading as our departed loved ones to make us believe those loved ones are actually alive, when in fact they are dead, asleep, in the grave, and so on. We see this foretold in Revelation 16, verses 13 and 14, where John saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. These evil spirits coming out of the mouths of the false trinity are further described elsewhere in the Bible. But here in this text, they are gathering together the entire world in a battle against God. Here's what it says in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 to 15. For such are false prophets, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ, and no wonder. For Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it's no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness. And we can put that righteousness in quotation marks, right? So-called righteousness. We should expect this demonic takeover of the apostate Christian churches just before the final test of faith over the mark of the beast, as predicted in Revelation 18:2. Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. When the false churches hit this marker, the voice of Jesus is heard through the spiritual confusion. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. What are her sins? She violates the commandments of God. She has broken her covenant with Jesus, and as a result, she has become the dwelling place of demons. This is spiritualism. Evil spirits masquerading as departed loved ones, deceiving the world into thinking, it doesn't matter how you live in this life. When we die, we all go to the same place, a better place. You can disobey God's commandments, but you will not surely die. That's what it means to speak like the dragon. What is pictured in our opening passage in Revelation 13 is spiritualism. In verses 13 to 15, this is described. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. There are lots of biblical backgrounds to this miracle of making fire come down from heaven. You have Moses in Egypt, who did this in the 7th plague of hail in Exodus 9:24. In that instance, the miracle showed who the true God was and who the true prophet of God was, Moses. The same miracle is repeated in the same for the same purpose in Elijah's day. The showdown between he and the 400 prophets of Baal took place on Mount Carmel. Both sides had their altars. They had each called upon their God. And the God who answers with fire was the true God, and his prophet the true prophet. This was totally unfair, by the way, because Baal is the Canaanite god of lightning and thunder. What's more, before Elijah prayed to his God, he had his wood and altar doused with a ton of water before he prayed. Well, as we all know, the God of Elijah answered, and everybody knew who the true God was and who his true prophet was because of the miracle of the fire from heaven. However, in Revelation 13, the same miracle is performed. The false prophet causes fire to come down from God out of heaven, but it doesn't prove anything except that his powers become incredibly deceptive. We read just a moment ago about the false prophet giving breath to the image of the beast, making this inanimate object come alive. This echoes the Old Testament imagery of the creation story when God bent over Adam's newly formed body, made in his own image, and breathing the breath of life into it, causing Adam to become a living being. This powerful state religion will be able to do even that. Give breath to the image of the beast. Incredibly powerful and deceptive beyond belief. This deception is so compelling. If we are not ready for it, it will lead us all to accept the mark of the beast. This is spiritualism. So there are three characteristics of the false prophet. One, it's a beast, that is a nation state. Two, it uses its political power to force false worship, combining church and state, something that Jesus said never to do. And three, it uses the power of spiritualism to deceive the world into receiving the mark of the beast. Now, before I close, I wish to read a statement that summarizes these findings and places us squarely in front of a point of decision. I'm reading from the 5th volume of the Testimonies for the Church, page 451, written some 130 years ago. Speaking of the false churches, she writes, not having a "thus saith the Scriptures" to bring against the advocates of the Bible Sabbath, they will resort to oppressive enactments to supply the lack. To secure popularity and patronage, legislators will yield to the demand for a Sunday law. Those who fear God cannot accept an institution that violates a precept of the Decalogue. On this battlefield comes the last great conflict of the controversy between truth and error. And we are not left in doubt as to the issue. Now, as in the days of Mordecai, the Lord will vindicate his truth and his people. By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy in violation of the law of God, our nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. When Protestantism shall stretch her hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power, when she shall reach over the abyss to clasp hands with spiritualism, when, under the influence of this threefold union, our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near. Friends, do you understand what we're reading here? This issue is not about government overreach or government telling us how to live our lives or government trampling on our personal freedoms or Republican versus Democrat or whatever else we're viewing on TV. In the Bible, the last great issue is whether or not we will keep God's commandments, including the commandment about the seventh-day Sabbath. And when the governments make laws that threaten our ability to keep God's commandments, then it has crossed the line with God. And we must be courageous to stand and obey God. Did you notice the conflict comes to its grand climax when the land beast, Protestant America, reaches over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power, with spiritualism, and repudiates the principles of its constitution and enforces a false Sabbath? We will then arrive at the end of time. Friends, I believe we are almost there. We are headed in this direction on a train that's had full speed ahead with no brakes. We are at the end of all things. The final test is about to come upon humanity. It will soon be known what kind of Christianity we embrace. Convenient Christianity, comfortable Christianity, popular Christianity, or a Christianity that stands for the right though the heavens fall. A Christianity that keeps the commandments of God and teaches others to do so. A Christianity that endures to the end, though the entire world is arrayed against it. We have peered today into America's future. A likeness, an image to the beast's kind of religion is being set up. The religion that tramples on the law of God with impunity. The religion that uses the power of the state instead of the power of truth and love to attract people to it. A religion that propagates lies instead of telling the truth. A religion that is tapped into the spirit of darkness instead of the Holy Spirit of light. That's America's future. And that's our future. We now know what the spiritual issues are. We know the cost of following Christ. My prayer is, in the midst of the impending conflict coming our way, in the midst of the persecution and threats to our lives and livelihoods, that we will take our stand firmly on the side of Christ. Because it is in the trial we will shine the brightest in our world, because it is in the trial we will meet our Jesus and find him altogether sufficient to see us through to the end. May God bless us all, both now and through to the end. Have a good Sabbath.